A moment from the past. The young duke's first chess game. For carriages entered the southern gate of Paris one after another, each decorated with a coat of arms, a shield crisscrossed with two red stripes. The procession was accompanied by a mounted guard. It was only part of a larger cavalry detachment that remained in the suburbs of Paris. Inside the city, fewer guards were needed. In one of the carriages sat 14-year-old Fernando de Braganza. His father, Fernando I, second Duke of Braganza, was sitting next to him. The Duke was a big man with a face mostly hidden by a thick black beard. He still wore his traveling armor, and a shirt of unexpectedly delicate pink peeked out from under the bright metal. A wide yellow sash was draped over his shoulder, the sign of ducal dignity. He was expected to arrive at this meeting in full regalia. The family carriage went first, followed by carriages with other family members and retinue. As the wheels slowly tapped on the cobblestones, Paris rose up above the travelers in all its splendor. The streets of 3- and 4-story houses were striking and elegant, the impression spoiled only by the clouds of smoke escaping from chimneys. Here and there the spires of cathedrals could be seen. Even the mills were stunning with exquisite architecture. Crossing the bridge over the Seine, the travelers began to pass women with heavy baskets in their hands. By the smell, it was clear that they were returning from the shore where fishermen were selling their morning catch. True to the Parisian elegant style, even the commoners' garments were alluring. Young Fernando's eyes darted everywhere. He saw a young man, a little older than him, sitting on the bank of the river and drawing something with a silver quill on a sheet placed on a small tablet. He realized that the young man was sketching a tall temple with 2 identical bell towers on each side. At the sight of the temple, Fernando cried out with delight.
Amazingly beautiful. We don't have anything like that. What kind of temple is that, Father?
Fernando's father squinted out the window and answered,
Notre-Dame de Paris, the Notre-Dame Cathédrale.
Young Fernando had never seen such architecture or artists who simply worked right on the street. As the travelers ventured further into the city, the passers-by, the horsemen, and the nobility looking out of their carriages became even more elegant. Soon the boy saw a crowd staring at some street performers. They tossed up one of their comrades who turned over in midair and landed sitting on the neck of his partner. Another artist juggled a dozen colored stones at once, not letting any of them fall to the ground. A man with a bare torso, his head wrapped with a white turban, made a frightful expression and suddenly spewed fire from his mouth. Women and children, squealing with delight, tossed small coins to the artists. Some members of the audience awarded them with loaves of bread, apples, and even a large fish with scales that sparkled in the sun. The gaiety of the people, even those who were dressed as artisans or mourners, was amazing. Finally, the Fernando family's carriage drove up to a huge estate surrounded by a high stone fence. The carriages rolled into a spacious courtyard in front of a magnificent palace, the corners decorated with 2 small round towers. Compared to the splendor of Paris that young Fernando had already seen, this was an even more luxurious building. A fountain was flowing in the middle of the courtyard with water falling from scattered spouts. Young Fernando squeezed his eyes shut, blinded by the brilliance of the sun on the water. Fernando I, often jealous in matters of honor, whispered at the sight of the other carriages emblazoned with the coats of arms of other aristocratic families. The Spencers, the Churchills, the Egmonts, Montfort-l'Aimorys, Wittelsbachs, Hohenzollerns, Radzivills. Young Fernando knew that the highest aristocracy of all Europe would gather at this festive dinner. He wondered why they had made the long journey from Portugal. Judging by the fact that his father, head of one of the noblest families in Portugal, undertook such a long trip, and especially with the whole family, very important issues would most likely be deliberated here. Such meetings usually preceded the meetings of monarchs themselves. As soon as the travelers entered the palace, the owner of the house and his family immediately greeted them. Young Fernando was questioned by two luxuriously dressed teenagers.
Venez-vous du Portugal? Peut-être êtes-vous le duc de Bragance? Comment avez-vous aimé Paris? Are you from Portugal? Are you Duke of Braganza? How do you like Paris?
Fernando smiled shyly. He knew little French, so he tried to switch to Latin.
Mi nomen es Fernando de Braganza. Ego sum de Portugal. My name is Fernando de Braganza. I'm from Portugal.
The teenagers, Fernando guessed from their faces they were brothers close in age, chattered in French again, talking not only to him but also to each other. He furtively examined their clothes. The younger brother was dressed in a daringly cut doublet made of shiny red, very beautiful fabric. The edges of a snow-white shirt peeked deliberately out from under the exquisite garment. Narrow, tight-fitting yellow stockings covered his legs, and his outfit ended with pointed shoes with barely noticeable heels. The elder brother was dressed similarly, only his stockings were white, and his doublet was blue. The necklines of the doublets would have been much more suitable for a lady, and were made from a fine fabric Fernando did not recognize but would later learn was silk. They were lively, liberated young men, whose facial expressions and gestures were as foreign as their language. The older brother's gaze was somewhat strange. He seemed to be looking through the person he was talking to, or at an imaginary wall behind that person. At the same time, the younger brother made direct eye contact and smiled. After rattling off a mountain of more incomprehensible words to Fernando, he took him by the hand and led him into the courtyard. There the young man began to tell him something, waving his hands at the fountain, well-groomed trees, neatly smoothed paths, and gazebos with benches inside. The Frenchman suddenly exchanged glances with his brother, and both laughed at the same time, and Fernando decided that they were probably laughing at him as if he were just a bourgeois from God-forsaken Portugal. Fernando remembered his grandfather's admonition, "If a donkey kicks you, and you kick back, you are both donkeys," and he decided not to pay attention to the boy's stupid antics. Meanwhile, more and more carriages arrived at the estate, accompanied by guards dressed to the nines, while the restless Frenchman continued to usher Fernando around the yard. Inside one of the gazebos, the young man showed Fernando a tiny tree. To his amazement, the tree had the shape of a sprawling century-old oak despite being only a span or so tall. Looking at Fernando's face, the Frenchman laughed. It seemed he was bragging about his wealth, and at the same time, taking advantage of the fact that Fernando did not understand French, secretly mocking him. However, Fernando continued to endure the scoffing. A beautiful girl and another young man came out into the courtyard. Both were also the same age as Fernando. While the girl was wearing a vibrant green pleated robe dress, the boy, for some reason, wore gilded armor. The boy in the armor made a strange image. A pale head peeked out of the dark breastplate, and he looked like a chicken coming out of an iron shell. In bright contrast, the beautiful girl had wide eyes accented by long black eyelashes. Her head was decorated with a bizarre pleated white veil, from under which blonde hair escaped in places. The younger of the brothers grabbed Fernando by the arm and dragged him to the couple.
C'est Fernando. This is Fernando.
He introduced his companion.
Et moi, je m'appelle Yves. And my name is Yves.
Mam na imię Anna. My name is Anna.
Said the girl.
A to jest Henryk. And this is Henryk.
Richest Henryk. Knight Henryk.
Corrected the young blond man, his golden armor shining. The Frenchman, who Fernando now figured out was named Yves, continued to chatter, and the more he talked, the more it was clear the others obviously understood him. The girl's speech was richly saturated with hissing sounds, and Fernando could not place what country she came from, but it was clear with Henryk. He was a German and from some warmongering territory. Fernando was eagerly taking in all of the amazing sights and sounds around him. However, he could not take his eyes off the girl. Her appearance, her grace, and her speech enchanted him. Eve was also obviously fascinated by her, perhaps even brazenly enamored. The girl was likewise captivated by Eve. He was Parisian, of course, and they had a reputation. At the same time, she also smiled at Fernando. Finally, Eve took the girl by the arm and led her into the gazebo, where a pitcher and a dish of fruit were laid out on the table. The girl turned around and looked at Henrique in confusion. Then she looked at Fernando. It seemed the Frenchman was beginning to tire her with his attention. Fernando melted with that look. What to do? How he wanted a moment alone with this girl and a chance to talk to her. But how can he compete with these Parisians and their ability to take girls by storm? Henrique and Fernando found themselves near a table with a chessboard. Fernando didn't know how to play, but he knew the names of the pieces. He took the white king from the board, showed it to Henrique, and made an inquiring gesture. Henrique nodded gravely, making it clear that he, Henrique, was in fact nobility. Then Fernando took the figure of the white queen and pointed it at Anna. Henrique smiled and nodded again. He took the hint. Then Fernando took a black rook, pointed at Eve, and placed it between the pieces of the king and queen. Henrique narrowed his eyes suspiciously. Fernando hit the rook with the king's piece, knocking the rook over on the board. He then joined the figures of the queen and the king as if in a kiss. Henrique finally realized what Fernando meant and rushed after the Frenchman. He caught up with him, shouted in a barking voice, and then punched the Frenchman in the face. The Frenchman fell and rolled on the ground, splashed by the spray of the fountain. His doublet and white shirt were immediately covered with dirt. The courtyard resounded with the screams of women. The guests sitting at the tables scattered among the courtyard and gazebos jumped up. From somewhere there was the sound of a sword being pulled from a scabbard. For a moment, everyone froze. Then something completely unexpected happened. Eve jumped up and, shaking off the dirt, ran away to the palace. Immediately, his brother came out into the yard. At the sight of the expression on his face, Henrique backed away but slipped and fell in the very puddle which had just soaked Eve. The yard was filled with laughter from the most astute observers. Henrique got up and hurried away. The brother, without looking at Anna and Fernando, went back to the palace in search of Eve. Anna looked at Fernando questioningly. Catching her eye, Fernando took a white pawn and placed it next to the queen's piece. Anna laughed. He led her to the miniature tree and pointed at it. At the sight of the curiosity, Anna laughed again and clapped her hands. Fernando realized that not only was she beautiful, but she also knew how to appreciate beauty. That evening, Fernando's hands touched a woman's body for the first time. Chapter 7. Siege and Escape. In the camp set up around the castle of Vila Viçosa, you could only walk up or down, because the castle stood on a high hill with steep slopes, and this exhausted the soldiers even before the assault began. Cursing each other, the horses, and the authorities, the gunners began to set up bombards in firing positions. Younger soldiers, grimacing from the strain, pulled stone stands from carts, struggling to drag them up the steep incline, and arranged them from corner to corner. Meanwhile, the old men skillfully rolled the bombards onto special stretchers and carried them to the stone stands. The horses, exhausted by the long march under the sun, greedily slurped water and chewed their oats while the cavalrymen removed the saddles and examined the horseshoes. The infantrymen were chopping down trees in a grove nearby and preparing fascines, bundles of branches to throw into the moat under the fortress wall. Soon the archers also came to their aid. The soldiers looked up at the square battlements of the walls and towers holding their helmets so they would not fall off their heads. The leader of the army, General Afonso, approached the wall accompanied by an entourage.
Hey there.
One of his officers shouted. This officer had already tried to talk to the castle guards but was turned away from the gate. A sentry's head, covered with a shiny round helmet, hung out of an opening between the battlements of the wall.
What do you want?
The sentry said calmly. The officer shouted.
Tell the Duke that General Afonso himself will speak to him now.
A few minutes passed. Another man appeared next to the sentry. He also leaned over the wall and shouted.
Heed our terms. First, all troops are to move away from the castle 1,000 paces. Second, General Afonso approaches the gate alone and unarmed, and we will lower the bridge to him. After crossing the bridge, the general will enter the castle and speak with Duke de Braganza. That is all.
Soon the general was granted entry to the castle. Duke Fernando II de Braganza was waiting for him outside the gate, not yet old, still handsome and strong in his armor. A doublet of black brocade embroidered with gold peeked out from under his iron breastplate. Orange trousers shaped like Chinese lanterns encircled the duke's hips. The duke was known for his indulgence in the most lavish fashions and remained true to his reputation even now.
Speak up, General.
The duke began immediately. Under de Braganza's gaze, the general took off his helmet. The wind chilled his scalp under his sparse, sweaty strands of hair.
The king's terms are as follows. The king promises to discuss everything peacefully with you if you leave the castle and come to him for negotiations. No harm will come to your family. That's the king's word. Additionally, Duke, not a hair on your head will be harmed if you allow my army to enter the castle. I swear on the honor of the general.
Yeah, is that it?
De Braganza said thoughtfully.
Well, I also promise that not a single hair on your head will be harmed, but only if you depart promptly with your army. In addition, I promise you that you will keep your position when the Cortes elects a new king. But, again, only on the condition that you immediately take your army back to where you came from.
The king is supported by the whole of Portugal.
The general said, involuntarily pulling himself to attention under the gaze of the duke's intelligent eyes.
The people won't support you. The king will not uphold the promises I have proposed if you do not allow my army to enter the castle. Think about it. I have received exceptional powers from His Majesty. Don't force me to storm the castle. Our bombards have pierced walls stronger than yours.
The Portuguese will never give up,
the duke said.
That's what makes them as brave as you, General. They will never surrender. When they come to the battle, there is no backing down, no room for cowardice.
Thanks to his well-established military intelligence, the duke already knew that Afonso's army was not large enough to take the castle by storm. Time was beginning to work against the general and his king because carrier pigeons were already carrying the duke's notes to the castles and palaces of his powerful associates. However, the Rubicon had been crossed, and the duke understood that the matter could no longer be solved with negotiations. War was unavoidable. Either the king or the duke, and their supporters in the Cortes and elsewhere, would win while the other would almost certainly face death. As soon as the general crossed over the bridge, his horse's hooves echoing on the planks, it immediately began to rise. The haste with which this was done was insulting, since the general was alone, and his army had retreated to a distance that made the horse seem no bigger than an ant. The duke was also in a hurry. As soon as the gate was closed behind Afonso, an officer wearing shiny, almost mirrored armor entered the archway under the wall. It was Stefan, the commander of the Vila Viçosa garrison. As expected of an officer in the presence of a superior, he kept his helmet on his bent left arm.
Did you hear everything, Stefan?
Fernando asked him. The duke's short brown hair seemed to the officer like a halo in the light of the sun's rays that broke over the walls.
Yes, Your Grace,
Stefan replied. His loud, commanding voice echoed in the archway.
I'll have to leave the castle,
The Duke said.
During my absence, you will receive 100 gold cruzados daily. This is not counting the payment to your subordinates. While I'm gone, you will continue to hold my flag over the keep. Let them think I'm staying here.
Duke de Braganza had a remarkable ability to do several things at once. And now, giving orders to the commander of his garrison, he was already thinking about where he would go to raise an army to expel General Afonso's troops from the vicinity of the castle and further resist the king. In the dead of night, the Duke and his family walked through an underground passage. Ahead, lighting the way with a torch, walked a page. Fernando's wife, Isabella, trotted behind the Duke. She held 2-year-old Dennis in her arms. The Duke's eldest son, 4-year-old Jamie, strode bravely beside her. From time to time Jamie ran his finger along the bricks of hewn stone, exactly the same as the walls of the castle here, leaving soot on his finger. The procession was brought up by servants, a nurse and a wet nurse. The Duke's court physician carried a leather bag with medicines and tools, not trusting it to anyone. The footsteps of the company reverberated with a strange, seemingly endless echo. 10 minutes later, the underground passage ended in a wide spiral staircase. Upstairs, near the open hatch, the Duke and his family were greeted by his secretary, Benicio. Above, the fugitives found themselves in the middle of a spacious but almost empty stable. Next to Benicio was the Duke's servant, Evandro, dressed as a simple soldier. Evandro had a twin brother, Jorge. In the village, the two brothers were never seen together. This was the rule of their secret life. Currently, Evandro was preparing horses for the fugitives' journey at the stable on the outskirts of the village, and Jorge, who was posing as a visiting owner of a stable of dray horses, was snoring in a neighboring house after a day shift of hard work. At the Duke's request, everyone except his wife left the stable for the courtyard which connected the stable with the village buildings.
Isabella,
The Duke said when the couple was alone.
You and the children will have to go to your friends, to Castile.
Isabella nodded. She had already anticipated this. The Duke continued and shadows ran across his face, as the draft stirred the flames of the torches every now and then.
Because I'm staying in Portugal. I'm staying to fight the tyranny of this madcap, our king.
Do you really believe that you will be supported?
Isabella asked.
Yes. Many times over, yes. The nobles and their representatives in the Cortes will support me. The nobles have money and a sufficient number of patrons who can make up an army. Yes, there are more peasants who support the king, but they have nothing. And for that same reason, the injustices of the king do not frighten them in any way. So far, the nobles are not a threat until the king starts extorting them. With their money, he will want to expand his army, build a new fleet to incite fear in all the coastal countries, and spy on every free-thinking subject. If we manage to unite the nobles, we can overthrow this king and choose a new one. The Cortes has the authority to do this.
Do you think the new king will take the Cortes into account?
Isabella whispered, adjusting the collar around her husband's neck.
A new law will be created explicitly for this. According to this law, the opinion of the Cortes will weigh exactly as much as the opinion of the king, no less, and this will be just the beginning. In the future, we will curb the king, following the example of England. He will not be able to lift a finger without the consent of Parliament. This is the only way to protect Portugal and its people from fits of insanity, which from time to time afflict the monarch in one country or another, including ours as well. Judge for yourself. Isn't it madness what Joao II started, having just ascended the throne? Would his father have dared to encroach on the rights of the nobility, on the privileges of his nobles, on their estates?
The conversation between the Duke and his wife was brief. Soon the Duchess, accompanied by servants and guards, set off. The Duke's secretary rode ahead, and Evandro brought up the rear. There was a single carriage in the middle carrying Isabella and her children. After a sleepless night spent on the road, and then a whole day of agonizing delays in Lisbon. The Duke lay in a bed, unable to fall asleep. His faithful servant and bodyguard, Prospero, on the other hand, slept peacefully on the floor across the room. The remainder of the Duke's retinue slept in other rooms of the inn. Throughout the day, the Duke did not receive a single message from his friends in the capital. The messengers the Duke secretly sent to them invariably returned with the same result. General da Costa, Admiral Pascal, the 3rd, 4th, 20th General Admiral Courtier, they had all left Lisbon. 500 people. To save Portugal, the nobility, and the people, the Duke only needed 500 people. Such a detachment would have been more than enough for the Duke because, by noon on the last day, he was convinced that the garrison of Lisbon had left the capital. In Lisbon, the Duke did not see a single soldier. There were usually no fewer soldiers among the passers-by than the ubiquitous monks. It was possible to smuggle so many soldiers out of Lisbon, but it was impossible to hide an army of several hundred people. So, it was the Lisbon garrison that was besieging the Duke's castle. For the Duke, the absence of a garrison once again confirmed the danger of Joao, both for the whole of the people and for the king himself, because even after being mentored by his father, he remained a stupid man and a narrow-minded monarch, a king who thought that the people really loved him enough to fight for him at the first call. As if the people's love for the king is worth anything without the support of the royal army, and even more so in the absence of troops. Now, if the Duke had the same number of soldiers under his command, even if not seasoned, battle-hardened slashers, but just grown, strong men armed accordingly, overthrowing the king would be the easiest thing. He didn't even have to be overthrown. The king had to be forced to reckon with the Cortes and issue a special law on this account. That's all. The Duke understood that now fate had given him an unprecedented and unique opportunity. The king, hoping to deal with the most dangerous of his enemies, that is, with Duke de Braganza, left himself unguarded. Finally, it dawned on the Duke that they must go to Porto as fast as possible before the fool General Afonso guessed that the Duke was not in his castle. The Duke had many friends in Porto. It was a huge city. He surmised there would always be 1,000 people there who were ready to enlist in any army for good money.
Prosper,
The Duke shouted.
get up. We're riding north to Porto.
Prospero immediately jumped up, energetic and ready to go as usual.
Shall I wake the others?
Yes, take Gennaro and Bronco with you.
On the way, remembering friends he could rely on, the Duke did not immediately think of Leandro, a prominent member of the Cortes of Leiria. It was not often that the Duke and the simple landowner Leandro met, even though he was one of his ardent supporters, but at the end of the next day, when the Duke was traveling to Porto and passed the vicinity of the fortress of Leiria halfway there, he already knew that he would spend the night nearby at Leandro's estate in Sinta. They arrived at the estate after sunset. Leandro, dazed with joy, there had never been such distinguished guests in his house before, ordered dinner to be prepared. Meanwhile, the Duke and his retinue were able to rest for a while. After dinner, Leandro and the Duke continued their conversation.
Of course, the representatives of the nobility in the Cortes now have every reason to refuse to oppose the king,
said the Duke.
But it won't help them. Sooner or later, the king will take everything from them, and then begin to exterminate the nobles and their families.
But why?
Leandro asked.
To create new nobles which will depend entirely on him. Such bloodletting occurs from time to time in many countries. When the old ways of common existence for some reason stop working, the king tries to get rid of the best people in the kingdom, and the best people have to attempt to dethrone the king. That's why my friends and I have decided to fight him to the bitter end. I have already told you the goal of this fight, and I will not repeat myself. I have only one question for you, dear Leandro. Are you with us?
Of course, Your Grace!
Leandro exclaimed.
In that case, you should start assembling your own mercenary army yourself. Let it be small, but it must be combat-ready. You will have to find people yourself, collect them, and keep them on your estate right now. Do you have enough accommodations?
Yes, of course. But unfortunately, I myself am not as healthy as I was just a few years ago, senor. I won't be able to sit on a horse anymore, but I can gather a small army to support Duke de Braganza and his companions. Tomorrow I will send my assistant Raul to Leiria. He will walk through its streets and all the taverns there. Let's see how many mercenaries he can gather that way. Meanwhile, his father, Francisco, will go around all my villages and also select strong guys that are more loyal to money than the king.
Fine, I never doubted you.
De Braganza said.
You have always been my good friend.
Leandro broke into a smile. The noblest nobleman of Portugal called him the holy word, friend.
When we assemble the main army in Porto and move from there to Lisbon, your detachment will join our army, as other factions will also join us everywhere along our route.
De Braganza continued.
Are you saying that you are no longer fit for military work? But how are your sons?
I have only one son.
Leandro sighed.
I am ashamed to say this, but he has not yet been trained in the art of war.
The Duke's look said that he either did not believe Leandro or was grieving over the disgrace that had befallen the gentleman's family. But the Duke decided not to ask unnecessary questions.
If our army is late, and you are waiting for it here in the meantime, you will be in danger. I am sure that the Castellan of Leiria will remain loyal to the king, and that your preparations will not escape the attention of his spies. He will be able to find out that you are gathering a mercenary army at your place before my army approaches you.
I'll warn Raul and Francisco.
Leandro replied.
They won't talk too much. Besides, they are local, and already know roughly who in our region would agree to become a mercenary.
We don't have much time.
The Duke continued. Judging by his face, he was already preoccupied with something else. Thinking a little, he asked,
You've been to Porto de Vila?
Of course, the village is very close. Fish are brought to us from there every 3 days.
My caravel is docked at Porto de Vila. She's there alone now. You'll find her right away. In case of danger, you can pick up the family and transport them to this caravel, and then get to us at Porto by sea. I'm sure you agree, this will be a much less dangerous path than traveling by land.
I agree.
Leandro nodded.
Thank you, Your Grace, for taking care of my family. I hope your family is in a safe place too.
Tell me, do you have enough funds to raise an army?
The Duke finally realized his discourtesy.
Yes, of course. I won't need any help in that matter.
Leandro said, smiling less virtuously than was required at the moment. After all, now Duke de Braganza himself was becoming his debtor.
And in general, I am ready to help you in all your endeavors.
Thank you. That's all I need. I think I'll stay with you for one more day. I will send my assistants on the same errand to other estates and wait for them here. Once I receive news from them, I will continue my journey to Porto.
It was already quite dark when the soft clop of horses' hooves was heard outside the windows of Leandro's house. The Duke sent 2 messengers from the estate, one to Porto and the other to the most influential of his friends in central Portugal. Both messengers conveyed the same task. First, to immediately begin to assemble a mercenary army, and secondly, to convey the same message from the Duke to his other friends. In the bosom of the messengers, there was a letter written by the Duke himself and certified with the imprint of his family ring. The idea of sending messengers came to the Duke when he thought that the letters sent by pigeon mail may need confirmation.